in Manhattan. So Jordan, they continue to pile in. Let's not wait. The hour is yours. Jordan.
Thank you, Dr. Kelly. And thank you all for coming. My name is Jordan Wasserberger. I'm a junior. I am so excited to be here tonight with three experts on criminal justice reform. Tali Farhadian, a Manhattan DA candidate who has spent decades working in our nation's judicial system. Ms. Farhadian has previously served under Judge Merrick B. Garland, the current Attorney General, and Justice Sandra Day O'Connor. More recently, she served as the General Counsel of the Brooklyn DA's office under the leadership of Eric Gonzalez. Nicholas Turner, president of the Vera Institute of Justice since 2013, has been a part of the organization since 1998. Mr. Turner has been instrumental in developing ideas for demonstration projects aimed at keeping troubled youth out of the justice system and easing re-entry for adult prisoners. He also guided the expansion of Vera's national work, launching and directing Vera's state sentencing and corrections initiative while supervising Vera's domestic violence projects and the creation of its youth justice program. Last, but certainly not least, Dr. Aaron Chalpin is a professor of criminology at UPenn and has researched a wide variety of topics within the criminal justice field. His current research is centered on precision policing, off-duty and overtime work by police officers, and the relationship between legal access to alcohol and sexual assault victimization. His past research has examined the effect of police manpower on crime and imprisonment and the relationship between crime and immigration enforcement, among other things. As Dr. Kelly said, I have a set of questions here that I'm going to read, but you all in the audience should feel free to send in as many questions as you have. I can't promise I'm going to get to all of them. I will intersperse them. It's going to be a great discussion. Before we get started, is there anything any of the panelists want to add? All right, awesome. Well, let's get into it. So this past week, we saw the conclusion of the trial of Derek Chauvin, the former Minneapolis police officer responsible for the death of George Floyd. The trial and verdict therein are monumental and a huge step forward in the name of equal justice for all. First, as a potential DA, an activist, and an academic, what are your reactions to the trial and conviction of Derek Chauvin? Mr. Turner, let's start with you.
Jordan, thank you. I guess I'll begin by saying that that to the extent that we believe that the jury's verdict was monumental, I actually don't think it was monumental. I think it should be characterized as expected, somewhat unusual. I think we dodged a bullet. It reminded me of waiting for that jury decision. Reminded me of waiting for the decision of the Simi Valley jury when Rodney King was beaten, and the fear that I had that the jury would make what appeared on the basis of all of the evidence that I was able to see, a wrong decision actually sent chills down my spine. And so I'm relieved that we arrived at the decision. What I hope that it does is instill in prosecutors, the importance and the need to bring these cases for individual accountability for police officers who were colleagues of Derek Chauvin, that in future trials that they will step up and testify when there's an act that is contrary to their training or to their policy or just abhorrent. That is something that commentators talked about as being really new. And I think the last thing that I would say is that we shouldn't be mistaken and think that this accountability in this particular instance, as significant and symbolic as it is the end all and be all. There's much work to be done around transformation of how we deliver public safety in this country. I'm sure we can get into that later, but this is really just one small, important symbolic moment.
Ms. Farhadian?
Yeah, thank you so much, Jordan, and thank you all of you for having me here. I agree completely with Nick. I think that was a relatively easy case. First of all, we saw a brutal murder caught on videotape, so you're not going to have stronger evidence than that. I shared that sense of anticipation that Nick was describing, that the jury would do the wrong thing, but afterwards, I also felt kind of a sense of sadness because there was so much, in the country hanging on this verdict. And, for those of us who work in this space, it was obvious going in that one verdict was not going to produce reform of policing. It was only going to produce accountability and some affirmation that the system can work in this particular case. And I think just as important, what happened after the verdict is when now Attorney General Garland, then Judge Garland, announced that the Justice Department was investigating the Minneapolis Police Department using actually a device that came into being after the Rodney King trial, to say that, to really change a police department, it's not going to come from a court case in the litigation. It's going to come from the Justice Department going in and suing an entire police department and coming to some sort of consent decree, is what we usually say, or an agreement with the department about the kinds of things that have to change to prevent misconduct or worse from happening over and over again. And I'm putting more hope in that. And then you have to remember there are about 18,000 police departments in this country, and each has to be fixed if it needs fixing on its own terms.
Dr. Schaufman?
Yeah, so I'll just comment briefly about what I think this means with respect to police reform. So, you think about some of the interventions that have been mentioned as maybe being promising with respect to reforming police departments. So you think about body-worn cameras, you think about something like de-escalation training for police officers. These are things that Minneapolis already had, right? And so when you think about what happened and what Derek Chauvin did, he didn't think he was doing anything wrong, right? Or he didn't think that what he was doing would be subject to any punishment. And so I think we need to think about accountability, right? It's not just a matter of changing training or, a few bad apples. Accountability really matters here.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, we saw after the trial concluded, people on both sides of the aisle within the moderate side of that spectrum lauded the trial as a reaffirmation of accountability. And kind of we're very pleased that the justice system didn't allow someone to exist above the law. On the other hand, some have voiced concern with the publicity of the trial and myriad of gubernatorial officials publicly commenting on what they hope the verdict would be, namely Congresswoman Maxine Waters and President Biden, might have had an impact on the jury's decision. Tali, as someone who spent her life deep in the inner workings of the judicial system, is there any potential truth to that?
Jordan, I think that observation goes back to our earlier discussion that for so many people, this was about more than just the one trial and holding this one person who had killed another for, to account. And we attached all these hopes and expectations to it. And go back to my earlier point that it is really important in every single case to achieve justice, but sometimes structural reform comes from policy decisions and not just the pursuit of one case.
Before we move on to the next question, I know I directed that at Tali. If anyone else wants to add anything, obviously feel free, as we can move on. Following George Floyd's death, NYPD Commissioner Dermot Shea disbanded the undercover units, get tasked with getting armed felons off the streets. These were the units engaged in stop and frisk efforts for individuals suspected of engaging in criminally suspicious behavior. In the months following the disbandment of these undercover units, arrests declined significantly. For example, narcotics arrests fell 85% and gun arrests dropped 67%. So first, are these drops results of an actual decline in those crimes or merely in the arrests being made? Dr. Schaufman, how should we read these and what's the impact of those statistics on public safety?
Yeah, so first I'll just say, these are recent events. It's very hard to know whether the increase in crime that we're seeing is due to the disbandment of those special teams at NYPD or if it's some artifact of the pandemic or something else entirely. Look, what's going on around the country, not just in New York, but in other cities as well, is police activity is going down. Police are pulling back. right? Stops are going down, searches are going down. Generally, weapons seized are going up, right? In fact, seizures of weapons in cities like Chicago and Philadelphia are up 200, 300%. What I think that means is that people are carrying more guns in them, right? People are carrying weapons more. And, you know, it's hard to speak to this as a researcher because, again, these events are so current, right? We don't have research that speaks to what's happening in the last year. But I personally worry that when the police are pulling back and not seizing the weapons, that the small number of people who drive the vast majority of the gun violence in New York City are emboldened, right? Now, you know, at the same time, right, New York City police have pulled back before. So in 2014, December 2014, January 2015, summonses go down 50%. Arrests for sort of low level quality of arrests go down 35, 40%. Over a 7-week period. Crime didn't go up, right? So, you know, there have been times when stop activity goes down, you don't get more crime in New York, and times when you do. In other cities, you look to sort of Chicago, I think is a good example. After the release of the Laquan McDonald video, which I believe was probably October, November of 2014, you do see a sustained increase in gun violence, and in some other cities as well that have had these high profile events. I think there's enough data out there now to be at least concerned that depolicing and police pulling back is creating more danger for disadvantaged communities with respect, again, to gun violence. Other crimes are still down in New York.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting that you bring up weapons seizing and gun violence specifically, because in New York, we've experienced a significant rise in violent crime. Through the end of 2020, murders were up 41% over 2019 and 53% over 2018. Shooting victims in particular were up 103% over 2019 and 109% over 2018. So does the police pullback also explain the dramatic rise in specifically violent crime in New York during the pandemic?
If this is a question for me, I think as a researcher, I'd have to say I don't know. I think there's enough research out there to be concerned. We know that police manpower is effective in reducing crime. It may not be the only way we can reduce crime, but it is effective. We know that when more police are in an area, crime goes down in that area. We know that when police are redeployed, let's say for reasons that have nothing to do with crime, like a terror attack redeploys police, we know that crime changes in response to police deployment. So, you know, anytime the police are less visible, I think we should be concerned if there's a large change in crime. It could be due to that, but we also are living through an unprecedented global pandemic, right? And there's less eyes on the street, fewer people to deter gun violence because they might be witnesses. There's a lot of other things that could be causing this, in addition to the stress of the pandemic. So very hard to know.
Jordan, I'd like to jump in and just sort of unpack and debunk the sort of easy conflation that we're doing, that if policing goes down, crime goes up. If policing goes up, crime goes down. It's actually a much more complicated relationship. If you look at the last decade in New York City, there's been a pretty dramatic reduction in felony arrests, as Aaron said, and when he was talking about the middle of last decade, but really for the past decade as a whole, a massive reduction in felony arrests, in misdemeanor arrests, in stop and frisk, in criminal summons. And up until like the last 2 years, when we have had, this increase in homicide and shooting, crime has continued to go down at roughly the same pace that it was going down the decade before, in fact, maybe speeding up a little bit more. So there's something else at work. It's not a seesaw. And I think when you're looking at last summer, you have to think about other occurrences that are less visible to people, which is that, we all know this, but the pandemic struck Black and Brown communities at a far greater rate than it did non-Black and Brown communities. If you stop and think about what that community-wide trauma, unemployment, food lines, grieving, it's dramatic. And imagine, I mean, we've all lived through the pandemic, and so we've all had our own traumas. But if you just think about how destabilizing that is, and then think about the economic destabilization on top of that, we don't know exactly how much that has to do with it, but then you also think about what happened to other support systems. So social service programs, after school programs, violence interruption that were, where social distancing, the need for social distancing rendered a lot of those things impossible. So I think it's important for us to not get trapped in a notion that law enforcement, conventionally and narrowly defined, is the thing that delivers public safety. There's a lot of scholarship out there about other things that deliver public safety too, and there was a lot of disruption over the past 2 years that suggests that those things might indeed have something to do with the increase in shootings and homicide. But to Aaron's point, we just don't know.
Jordan, let me jump in here too to say that look, I agree with Nick that the traumas and the dislocations of the past year have undoubtedly contributed to the increase in crime. There are studies that show when there is a major shock to a society, that's what happens. A great study that shows that after Hurricane Katrina, domestic violence rates went up, and they stayed up for a long time after. And I think that's a pretty good analog. But your question was particularly about anti-crime, the anti-crime units. And I think it's a really interesting study in police reform, because there was very good reason to disband that unit. I mean, I remember when I was, doing gun cases and violent crime cases as a prosecutor, it was hard to put an anti-crime police officer on the stand because there was so much distrust of this unit that in so many communities was regarded as a kind of invasive force that was coming in, not working with communities, but working against them. But on the other hand, they did take a lot of guns off the streets. And I think the question is not, do we think that the increase in gun violence is due to the disbanding of anti-crime? But to me, the better question is, don't we need a unit that's getting guns off the streets in some way now that there have been this radical increase in shootings? I mean, over the past weekend, just this weekend, there were 15 shootings. And today at about 2:30 this afternoon on 95th and Park, there was a shooting that resulted in a death. And, this is why I think reform has to be more than just taking away something that does not work or that is alienating to people, but then replacing it with something else. Because, guns that are in New York City are not supposed to be here. That's the good thing about living in a blue state and a blue city. And so our first responsibility, I think, as law enforcement has to be to get the guns out of people's hands.
Both Nick and Tali brought up the notion of alternate ways to enforce laws as opposed to traditional men and women in blue, opposed to traditional NYPD officers, and we will get into some of the reforms that have been proposed around that. Before we do, though, Mr. Turner, a massive part of Viewers' work has been in and around the prison system. And so in May of 2020, NYPD data revealed that 19% of those suspected in or arrested for 2020 shootings were out on parole at the time. So while this one incident certainly does not make a trend, could this warrant a reevaluation of efforts to instill more lenient parole decisions?
Well, Jordan, I'm not familiar with that data, but when we reformed the bail system here, NYPD produced data that said that the majority of people who had committed crimes had been released as a result of bail reform, and that data was incorrect. And it was a statement that Commissioner Dermot Shea made, and it was parroted by Mayor de Blasio. So I'm not going to accept it on face value. I've seen difficulties with NYPD data, and I've seen it misused sometimes. I will say, however, that that there is no you know, there's no policy that is going to prevent terrible things from happening. And one of the things that is most troubling about the way that we talk about reform or talk about things that mitigate the burdens of the justice system is that when bad things happen, people quickly throw up their hands and say, well, you know, it must be bail reform or it must be parole. Let's eliminate parole. I mean, that is the story of American mass incarceration for the past 5 decades, which is to tighten the screws, and it's the kind of thing that led to mandatory minimums and habitual offender laws that keep people in prison for 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years. And I think if you look at it a different way, one of the things that you know is that long prison sentences have very diminishing returns. And you might ask a different question, which is it appropriate for society to lock people up, to not give them an opportunity to earn their way out through behavior or good work or programs? And do we simply not believe that that's possible, or that there might be a small minority where something goes wrong, and therefore we're going to toss the whole policy away? So I have a hard time with that argument, obviously.
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense. Obviously, we can't use the minority of cases to toss out the whole pot. But certainly, we need to figure out the right way to do things. We minimize the chance of something bad happening as much as possible. In the realm of police-community relations, we've seen a lot of things crop up over the summer. The biggest one is police-community interactions, especially minority communities and low-income neighborhoods, have been bad. Right? We've seen a deep level of distrust for good reason in those communities when it comes to traditionally uniformed and out of uniform officers. On the flip side, Brooklyn Borough President Eric Adams has complained that his constituents aren't getting the police response they deserve. This is a trend we've seen across plenty of low-income neighborhoods, not just in New York, but also in cities like Chicago and Philadelphia. The problem here is simple. Is this putting the NYPD in an untenable position? Is the fear in the NYPD and hostility towards it from the outside ultimately going to hurt lower income or minority neighborhoods the most? Ms. Weinstein, do you want to start us off?
Sure. Although, Jordan, I'm kind of tempted to go back to your exchange with Nick about parole just for a moment, because this is something that I care deeply about. And I was not familiar with that statistic either, but I actually think it's kind of not the right question to ask, like, were people out on parole when they reoffended? Because to me, the more important question is, are we getting sentence lengths right? And second, and really echoing Nick here, with whom I have visited prison, and he's really opened my eyes to lots of things. Are we preparing people to come back into society safely and not a risk to others, but actually able, to thrive and to have a second chance? And in New York, we've kind of moved past parole in lots of cases. Often people are sentenced to mechanisms where there isn't that kind of check. And I think instead, like, now is really the time to take a hard look at prison lengths. And my sense is that, on the whole, prison sentences in America are just too long. They are too long in many, many cases. And by too long, I mean not advancing public safety, have no public safety purpose. And we have lots of data collected by the Vera Institute and other places that show us that in sort of sister countries, sister democracies, sentences are radically shorter without people coming out and reoffending at the kinds of rates that, your earlier question suggested would have to be true. And I think this is actually the next frontier of criminal justice reform. We've spent a lot of time, those of us working on reform, on a lot of the front end issues of who's going into the criminal justice system, who is entering it. And I think that really the next chapter is going to largely focus on how people are getting out of prison and when they are getting out of prison. But you wanted to ask me a question about policing and mistrust of the police. And I just couldn't help getting into it with Nick. So I could go back to that if you like. Look, I think it's always when the police is not, when it's not working as it should be, people don't trust the police, or the police are not coming in with a core commitment to public safety. Of course, the people who suffer the most are people who live in communities with more crime, who are dealing with more violence, and that's just so horribly unfair. And I appreciate your question very much, because it's really, I think, you're focusing on who are the victims of crime and how are they being let down when law enforcement is not functioning as it should be.
I have two follow-ups I want to ask. First, you brought up this point that you believe the next frontier of criminal justice reform is on sentencing and parole in that sphere. I think that's really interesting, because so often when we hear about criminal justice reform in the media, it's not that. Right? The most popular narrative that gets talked about is police themselves. Things like defund the police, abolish the police, removing the militarization of police, etc. That's what we always hear from our major outlets. We don't often hear about what you just discussed, which is parole and sentencing. So do you think that there's a disservice being done to the criminal justice effort, that that the new frontier, as you put it, is kind of being pushed under the rug?
Well, we're just going to have to do more than one thing at a time if we want to get this right. And I'm not trying to put these different strategies into competition with each other, but I do think that often what happens at the back end, as I'm describing it, has been pretty mindless. I'll give you an example. When I was in the Brooklyn DA's office, I learned that the practice there, and I'm really feel sure that this is a practice all around the country, was for prosecutors to write a letter opposing parole at the time that a person was convicted or sentenced, and then to put it into a file. And then decades later, when that person would come up for parole, they would remove that and dust it off and submit it to the court without, and like, what's the point of that, right? Without any consideration of what's gone on. Has this sentence been long enough? Have we changed as a society in our values and what we know about sentence lengths? So it just seems to me an area really ripe with opportunity. And it kind of goes back to what you said before, Jordan, a system that feels unfair and is overwhelmed and is not delivering on justice is not going to be a system that people have confidence in. People are not going to want to come forward if they feel like they're sending, even someone who's committed a crime into a world that is unfair, where they might emerge, with a grossly excessive sentence, for example. And so, getting that right, it is also about getting the kind of trust in original encounters with the police and prosecutors that you asked about, right?
Aaron and Nick, I know that was a long series of discussions. If there's anything you guys want to add, please feel free. Otherwise we can move on. Yeah, Aaron?
I'll just be very brief. So I think Tali's absolutely right. When you think about mass incarceration, that's not driven by investments in police. That's driven by choices that we've made with respect to laws that we've passed and the way that prosecutors have done their jobs. If anything, it looks like when you invest in police, the number of serious arrests go down because police affect crime through both deterrence and incapacitation, deterrence being probably the most important mechanism. When you think about putting people in prison for a long time, right? Most people who are committing crimes, they're not thinking about the next 10 years of their lives, right? They're thinking about the next 10 minutes. So there isn't a lot of deterrence value, right, that you get from long prison sentences. Yeah, I'll leave it at that. I agree with you, Tali.
Jordan, can I just jump in on this? I mean, I will co-sign to both things that Tali and Aaron say, and like we have to, walk and chew gum at the same time. I want to sort of, unquestionably, I mean, this is a country that mass incarcerates at a internationally aberrational level. So 2 million people incarcerated. It's compared to Western European countries that we deem to be our peers. It's 6 to 10 times more. That's a problem of people being stacked in prison for a long time on really long sentences. As Tali talked about, and we'll never solve mass incarceration without actually addressing the sentence length. And we do, in fact, I think there are 200,000 people who are serving life sentences in this country. A life sentence in Germany or the Netherlands or Norway or Sweden is 21 years. So it's actually not real life. It is, you have a chance to return back to society. But the policing conversation is actually really important because we have a mass arrest problem in this country too. We arrest 10.5 million times a year. So like literally every 3 seconds, someone's being arrested. It just happened now. It just happened now. And then you might think, well, a lot of bad guys out there, lots of people toting guns and, people who are engaged in sexual assault and robbery and so on. But when you look at those figures, 5% of those arrests are for violent crimes. 80% of those are for crimes of poverty and substance use and mental illness. And so what we've actually constructed with $115 billion a year is a policing apparatus in this country that is like the wide end of a funnel, except it actually sucks. It does, you don't pour things in it, it like sucks people in. And for a variety of offenses that I think as a society, we could probably agree could be treated differently. Why do we send 2 police who are armed to deal with homelessness? Why do we have police in schools? So the whole conversation about divest and invest and defunding sort of gets to this very issue. Why do we send people who are decompensating because they're mentally ill? Why do we send police to respond to those things? Why are we not using public health mechanisms and agencies to address that? And it's not a small matter. And let's just go back to George Floyd, who was arrested for allegedly passing a counterfeit $20 bill. But you can then go back to Eric Garner, who was, brought down by the police of Staten Island because he was selling Lucy's, single cigarettes, that's a violation of New York tax code. That's not a criminal thing. You can look at Philando Castile, and he was stopped because he had a broken tail light. You can look at Sandra Bland. You can go sort of on. And every time there's an interaction with the police, there is risk of bodily harm or death. And if we've over-criminalized a lot, or we ask the police to enforce on a bunch of conduct that is not so serious, we're going to encounter these huge challenges. So I think we have both the mass incarceration problem, but we have the wide end of the funnel, which again is not a funnel, it's more of a vacuum. It's like that little contraption that you put on your vacuum when you want to it's not the really narrow one to sort of get in the corners. It's the big wide mouth that you use to sort of suck things in. And that's the way our system operates in part. And it's a really important thing to address in terms of policing.
Before we get into more of the active reform efforts that are going on, Tali, in light of everything that's happened in the past year with the deaths of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, a renewed focus on police-community relations, and the conviction of Derek Chauvin, should the enforcement role of the law enforcement role of the Manhattan DA's office change moving forward? And if so, how?
Well, so Jordan, I think it's really great that people are now really engaged in and paying attention to the choices that law enforcement makes. For the police, the choices of what to arrest, and for prosecutors, the choices of what to charge. What arrests to turn into criminal charges, and then to decide, well, what do we want to do with them? Do we want to put somebody on a path to prison? In some cases, that's the right thing. In others, do we want to divert them to some other kind of program that would better advance public safety? And I don't know if I would say we have to change so much as we have to do better in fulfilling our core mission, which is to keep people safe while playing by fair rules. right? By treating like cases alike and treating every person alike. And obviously we've gotten a lot of this really wrong. So I will just, answer what I think is the way forward. When we think about how to use our resources as police or as prosecutors, I think we have to be looking out for the people who are the most vulnerable and who need us the most to keep them safe from harm, whether it's right now, it's Asian Americans in New York City who have been disproportionately the victims of hate crimes, or people who are themselves and their families are suffering gun violence, or I'm really worried about what's happened in the escalation of domestic violence this year while people have been stuck at home. And to me, that's really always been our job, and we haven't done it right. Making sure that we are looking out for the people who need us most. And I'm just going to tell you something that I learned from Nick Turner ages ago that has just stayed with me for so many years, that I think is sort of an answer to this question. So I think it might have been around like 2015, but Nick will correct me if I'm wrong. The Vera Institute went to study a DA's office in Milwaukee. And the question the DA had there was whether he was charging people differently based on their race, based on the race of the defendant. And they looked at some category of cases, and they found that they were not operating by rules of fair play and justice, in the sense that they were absolutely discriminating and charging Black defendants more severely for the same crimes. But the other thing that they found, and this always stuck with me, was that if the victims were Black, they were not taking the crimes as seriously. So if someone broke into your house and stole your TV, depending on who you were, your race, the family that was victimized, the police all the way up to prosecutors would treat that case really differently. And I just think that 360 view is, to me, incredibly important to making sure that we're taking the same harm with the same care, with the same seriousness, with the same commitment, no matter who is on the receiving end of it.
We've all talked a lot about, in the realm of reform, who is best situated to respond to criminal activity or to calls to 911. Nick brought up the notion of people going from a mental crisis or a drug or alcohol-related crisis. Tali, you talked about domestic violence and things like that. One of the more popular reforms that's been proposed over the past year has been a shift away from traditional police officers and towards something like social workers, right, for addressing situations involving drugs or a mental health crisis or something similar like to that. Given that many of these situations can turn violent, can a social worker respond appropriately and properly ensure the safety of innocents? And maybe a better way of getting at the issue is this: what situations currently being addressed by police officers would be better and more appropriately handled by social workers? Aaron, let's start with you.
Yeah, so I test the hypotheses more than I generate them. So I'm waiting to see a city do this at scale, and I'd love to go in and evaluate it. There's been some small scale efforts. Look, I think there's a lot to like, right, about reform like this. There clearly are calls that don't require a police officer, and for which a police officer is not the most appropriate intervention. Having said that, right, this is the kind of thing where there's a lot of bugs to work out. You have to recruit a workforce that's skilled enough to do this work. You have to train that workforce. You have to train the 911 dispatchers, right? And you also have to worry about some terrible thing happening that derails the whole project. So we have to have a stomach for this, right? We have to recognize that there's some risk involved, that the people who stand to benefit the most from these targeted risks also could be the people on the losing end if they don't work out. So I think just tread lightly, work carefully, and try to pilot some of these programs and work out the kinks. So I'm optimistic. But at the same time, there's a lot of police calls. There's a lot of calls for police service where really there isn't a clear substitute for the police officer. Like if someone's having a mental health crisis, maybe you can send someone like a social worker. But when someone calls and says, my husband or boyfriend is threatening to kill me, you're going to need a cop, and that is a frustratingly common type of 911 call in a city like New York.
Nick?
Yeah, I mean, Aaron is totally right that there's virtually nothing in the country at scale that has attempted to do this work. That's a function, that's a societal choice. That's a governmental choice to invest in community safety through law enforcement only, and to overinvest in that, and then to have a a sort of a poverty of investment in other things that provide civic structure and infrastructure, public health responses. But so there are a number of areas that I think we could explore, and I think that cities increasingly are exploring them. Again, there are a number of cities around the country that have gotten police out of their schools. They attempt to address security and safety in a different way. There are a few cities on the West Coast that are saying, look, police do not need to be enforcing traffic violations. So we can approach this in a different way than having two folks with guns on their hips. There's social workers, as you mentioned, responding to homelessness. Austin took $150 million out of its police budget, and part of what it's investing in is buying two unused hotels to turn them into supportive housing for people who are chronically mentally ill. So I think that there are a lot of answers that are out there, and that this is the right direction. But it is it's generally new for this country, and so there is some discomfort with that experimentation. It flies in the face of our understanding, of the popular understanding about what delivers public safety. And so therefore it makes us nervous. I think the last thing that I want to say on this topic is that, one of the things that is generally not well understood and not well studied are, what are the social costs of relying on arrest too much? What happens to people and their families and their communities if our societal response to things is arrest? Brennan Center for Justice did a really interesting study that showed that a misdemeanor conviction for someone would drag down their lifetime earnings 16%. That's a real cost. I mean, to put aside what might happen if someone ended up spending time in jail and maybe lost their job or lost their home, or maybe even lost their children for a time to the child welfare system. So I think, arrest as a response is not without its detriments, and it's something that we need to think about. And law enforcement, which tends to be a pretty harmful touch, sort of no matter how you slice it, we have to think about those costs when we are making the choice that's the response that we want.
Tully, your thoughts?
Sure. So Jordan, I do think that we do need to be developing all around the country cadres of first responders to go out into situations that don't call for force or law, which are the things that we need police for. But I'll tell you what I'm struggling with when you get down into the details of it, and this is to echo a bit of what Aaron said, is if we just put costs and other things aside, I think in an ideal world, there are some situations where you would want both a police officer and a social worker. And I'm not saying that I'm now calling to, double the size of the response, but just to work this out theoretically. For example, in a domestic violence situation, which is often what's on the table in these conversations. It is absolutely true that the police are not themselves well equipped to meet the needs of everybody in that home when they go out on that call, and that many survivors of violence have said this. A man with a gun coming out here is making everything worse and not better. It's escalating the situation, and a person who is experiencing domestic violence needs help with social work and housing, and what's she going to do about her kids, and is there an immigration angle, and so many things that are not right now within the competency of a police officer. But on the other hand, in domestic violence, the first thing that you're supposed to do when you're responding to a domestic violence incident is what is called a risk assessment, to see if the survivor, let's say it's a woman and the assailant is a man, is at the risk of what looks like a minor assault suddenly turning into a homicide. And we have a framework for this. We have tools for, how to check whether she's at risk for this, and it's stuff that's not necessarily obvious. And we want a police officer to be there if it is going to turn into a high risk situation. And so I think that this is what we really have to work out. And maybe what we need is, in some cases, police officers who are just trained differently and are trained better, and have some of those other things under their belts, in addition to, the holster.
Yeah, certainly. I think the question of how, not only when do cops respond, what cops respond, but also how cops respond is really important. It's so interesting. In the past year, we've unfortunately seen, at least it's felt like to me, a rise in either the amount of police malfeasance in our nation, or, and what it hopefully is a rise in the amount of publicity around police malfeasance in our nation. But even within malfeasance, there does seem to be cases like, for example, Ma'Khia Bryant and Dante Wright, which are tragic killings, but don't appear to be racially motivated, have been called racially motivated. A case like George Floyd, which very clearly was a police officer who was exerting extreme and unwarranted violence in a racially motivated way, we can clearly see that was a racially motivated case. How do we distinguish between the two, right? I mean, in the case of Ma'Khia Bryant specifically, from the footage that's been released, it's very clear she had a weapon, she was attempting to stab the other woman, and had that officer not intervened, she probably would have been successful. So how do we separate those instances of racially motivated police violence, like George Floyd, like Breonna Taylor, from these other interactions that, while should never happen, while we should never get to a point where we have to kill, or the police officers have to open fire and kill someone, that, at least in the case of Dante Wright and Ma'Khia Bryant, isn't necessarily racially motivated. Yeah, Aaron?
Yeah, so I don't know that you can reliably look at a given incident, absent some clear piece of evidence, and know what was in the officer's heart and what was in the officer's mind. Having said that, right, there are signatures in the data of discriminatory behavior. So, for example, in Florida, state troopers, right, they hand out tickets for speeding, and a ticket where you are going 10 miles per hour over the speed limit carries a bigger fine than if you're going 9 miles over the speed limit. And what you persistently see is that white drivers are getting that break more than black drivers, right? And you can see it. It's driven by about 40% of the officers. 60% of the officers aren't doing it, right? So that's a signature of discriminatory behavior. In this case, the discrimination operates via leniency, right? So it's from a policy perspective, it's a little bit hard to know what to do about that, but it's a tool, right, that you can use to retrain officers, right? Hey, did you know that you seem to be giving more leniency to white drivers than black drivers, right? We're monitoring this, right? You can look at hit rates, right? So the rate at which officers stop someone on the street, the rate at which that stop ends up being successful, like let's say it nets a firearm or something like that. And if hit rates are different for black versus white citizens, that can be a marker for potentially for discriminatory behavior. So I think that's something that could be used to hold individual officers accountable. There are statistical problems with this stuff, there always are, but it feels like a reasonable starting point, at least to me.
Holly?
Jordan, when I think about how we hold ourselves accountable as institutions for racial disparities that come out of our institutions, this is where, to piggyback off of Aaron, I think it's really important to think about systems or the institution as a whole and to look really carefully at the data. That study that I cited in Milwaukee, this was about something happening over and over again that the district attorney couldn't even put his finger on, until he brought folks in. I'll give you a different example. One of the things that I did in Brooklyn was that I went back with the Innocence Project and studied the first 25 exonerations in our conviction review unit. First time, 25 times that the office stood up and said, this person was wrongfully convicted. He has to be released from prison. And 24 out of the 25, looking back, were Black or Latino defendants, and 24 out of 25 of them were men. And I think that's really, as we're talking about reform of institutions, that's really where we need to kind of start. We need to take that broader view, and then we need to make systemic changes and to be really transparent about what is happening. This is apart from an individual cases, looking to see what was in a person's heart when they did something wrong.
Yeah.
Yeah, Jordan, I think I would just add that, indeed it is sort of hard to know what is in someone's heart, but and so it may not always be racial motivation, but I'm sure you're familiar with the term implicit bias. And that's something that we all carry with us. And, in this society, I think it is frankly impossible to not be biased. And there's a long history in this country and just reams of research that shows that we associate Black skin with criminality, and not because we've necessarily had experiences, but because this is what society shows us. So this is the frame of the conversation. Willie Horton, gangbangers, super predators. It's all this. It's an iconography of criminality that is really, and it goes again back centuries, that is rooted in Black skin. So people carry that around with them, and they don't think, well, there's a Black guy, so I'm therefore gonna, give him a speeding ticket. That's, because it's saying that he was 11 miles per hour over the speed limit, but people like unconsciously make judgments, and that happens every day. And that very well may have happened in the two cases where you said, well, there may not have been racial motivation. We don't know, but why did the police officer in Brooklyn Center even pull out a taser when when Dante was walking back to get in his car? Did she perceive a threat that required her to do so, or was that something that was just sort of in her subconscious? But it happens to us all the time. We can't name it, we can't identify it, but it is something that ends up leading to racially disparate impacts at every part of our system, because we're all victimized by that.
Well, I'm glad we've gotten into the conversation on the institutionality of what we're talking about here, because one of the biggest clashes, even amongst social justice advocates and activists, has been the question of institutional versus what I'd call bad apple racism. And some advocate that anyone who wears the badge is inherently racist. Others insist that it should be taken on a case-by-case basis. Is either side right? Is there a better way to look at this challenging issue that isn't currently in the public discourse? Tali?
Jordan, I think it's insane to say that anybody who wears a badge is a racist. I think that's kind of a shocking statement. I think that we both have to hold individuals accountable when they commit crimes, no matter who they are, no matter what uniform they're wearing, right? And that's where we started the conversation tonight. And then at the same time, reckon with how all of our institutions have produced, so many government institutions, from healthcare and hospitals to the criminal justice system, have produced outcomes that we are not proud of, that we are ashamed of, that have perpetuated racial disparities, and to go in and make the changes that we've talked about in the course of this night. And I think that we can absolutely do both of those things without tarring the people who work in these institutions entirely.
Nick?
Yeah, I think that that's fair. I also think that it's really important for us to consider the possibility that that institutions which historically were rooted in racism, so it's it's been so oft repeated, but that people might feel it's a cliche, but policing in America emerged out of slave patrols. There's a history of policing in America of not protecting Black people, of not responding to duress and to violence and to need for help, to not protecting Black victims. There's a history in America of enforcement choices being made to the detriment and, in fact, not considering the impact on Black lives. So take stop and frisk in this city. People seem to be comfortable, so did Commissioner Kelly, in stopping 700,000 young people, mostly young people a year, mostly Black and brown, with very little data to show that it was getting guns off the street. And so those choices get made, and the data, and you always see it, drug possession, Black people are arrested at 3 times to 4 times the rate as white people, yet we know that drug use is the same. So if someone sort of says like, I don't know that I can really believe in this system. I'm not so sure that I can believe in this institution and that it's reformable. I think we got to walk in their shoes and try to really understand that, and that's incredibly important. And so that's what I sort of want us to remember. And I'm sure there are people in the audience who relate to that, and there are others who don't. But American policing has a troubled and difficult history. There is no part of the study of American policing that hasn't demonstrated racially disparate outcomes. And so, that distrust is real, and the distrust that you can reform that system and sort of cleanse it of all that is not an unreasonable thing.
Good.
Yeah, so I think I would just add to this that we live in a very unequal society, right? Where, we have police that we throw into the mix, and we expect police to deal with some very weighty problems that we as a society have all created, right? So I think it's right that there are some institutional features of policing that have, been created racially disparate impacts, right? I think that's a fair statement. At the same time, we send police, we deploy police on the basis of where violence happens. Now, once the police are there, if they notice incivilities, people using drugs, well, if their mandate is to go and deal with that because we as a society mandate them that way, then they're going to do that, right? I think individual police officers, they want to arrest the bad guys, right? But when they're told by their supervisors, like if you see someone who might have some drugs on them, go stop them, search them, arrest them, they will do that. So I think sometimes it's very easy for us to, throw police under the bus because we don't want to deal with the fact that we're all sort of complicit in creating the society that we have. One other thing I just want to briefly touch upon is when we think about modern policing in the United States and the first police forces formed in large US cities, so cities like Boston, New York, and Philadelphia, these really don't come out of a tradition of slave patrols and slave catchers. These are really coming out of tradition of policing that's born in London and then forged in our cities because of urban riots, and largely urban riots that were perpetrated not by Black people, but by white people. That when we start getting these big cities that can no longer be policed via social control, and you have people of different ethnicities rioting, that's when there's this perception that public safety requires something like police. So Nick, I don't know that I quite agree that that's how our modern police forces have evolved, but I think many of the things you said are completely true.
Jordan, if I may, just be mindful of the time.
Yeah.
A terrific job. It's an incredible conversation.
Yeah. We've only got one question left. First, I just want to say I agree with all the statements that were just made. While the generalization of police that often gets made, especially in the modern era on social media, in the general news media, is heartbreaking, there's a lot of stuff that we have to reconcile with as Americans. There's a lot that we are just now starting to really tackle that's going to take a long time. but we have to be careful not to take entire groups of people for the worst parts. Last question here, just to end us on a hopeful note. In a matter of months, New York is going to have, for all intents and purposes, a new mayoral administration. It won't take office to the fall, but in June, we're going to know who is the next mayor and what their administration is going to be. So for each of you, I just want to know, what would you like their focus to be with regard to criminal justice reform? Where do you hope to see that things go? Tali?
Well, so it's interesting because this panel was about criminal justice reform generally, and we spent most of our time talking about policing, which of course the district attorney and prosecutors do not control, although we partner with them, we shape them, we hold them accountable, we argue with them, we work with them, we have lots of relationships with them. And of course, it's the mayor in New York City who appoints the police commissioner and is in charge of the police. And so from my perspective, I want to see a mayor who is committed to both reforming and leading the police, because that would certainly make my job a lot easier if that was a priority for the next mayor.
Aaron?
Yeah, so I'm just the researcher. I generally test the hypotheses, don't generate them, but I'll step outside that a little bit and just say, I'd like to see a focus on the people who are carrying around guns. They are driving mostly the social costs that we're talking about. Less of a focus on the people who are, committing the crimes of poverty. I think there's a fair amount of evidence that low-level quality of life arrests don't have a lot of public safety value, but there are things that the police can be doing that can be more precise, going after the gangs and crews that are picking up the guns, recognizing that there are social inequities that lead to that behavior, but also recognizing that that creates a lot of trauma for the people who have to live around it. With respect to police reform, I think one thing that I think is not really low-hanging fruit that I'd like to see done is extend probationary periods. So right now, if you're a police officer in most cities, after 18 months, you have tenure, so to speak, and it's pretty hard to fire an officer at that point if they, if they do something bad that's not bad enough. Why not push that out to 4 or 5 years? Let's have a little more data. And I think at that point, we can better identify the bad apples than we can in 18 months. We probably could not have identified Derek Chauvin as a bad apple with only 18 months of data. A little more data, I think we might have been able to do it.
And finally, Nick?
I agree with both with Tali and Aaron. I think I would also like to see a little bit of budget justice. And so what I mean by that is in the last 10 years in New York, arrests have declined. Again, I shared those statistics by about 50%. If you account for inflation, the NYPD budget has not declined at all. So the per enforcement action, we're spending more and more. If you look at it in the corrections context, it's why it now costs about $500,000 to house someone in the Department of Corrections, because while the population of the jail system has dropped dramatically, we have not reduced the budget of it. And budgets are moral documents, so this isn't something for the police commissioner or the corrections commissioner to do. This is something for the mayor to do, which is to say, particularly after this pandemic, we have seen the underinvestment in public health, and we're willing to invest in that and to make some of the right choices and distribute our investment in a different way than we have in the past.
All right. Well, with that, that concludes our panel. Thank you guys so much for coming, for everyone in the audience. Thank you guys for tuning in. This is a great discussion. I thought this was great. So thank you all, really. This is phenomenal.
And Jordan, let me pat you on the back, my friend. A lot of work went into this. I want our panelists and our guests to know, class of 22, this is a junior rising to senior year. And well done, my friend. You are a pleasure to work with, and we're honored to have you here at HM. And again, to our panelists, our school's yours. We're thrilled to have you involved in the Life of the Mind tonight. And thank you for supporting Jordan and the community's interests too.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Good night, everyone. Thank you.
Night.
And thank you to our participants.
Good night, everyone.
Bye,
Night.
Tolly. Bye, Aaron, Jordan, Tom.
Bye, everyone.
Take care. Nice meeting everyone.
You too.
You too.